Welcome, everybody. We're glad to be sharing some time with you this afternoon, and we're especially glad to welcome Dr. Mimi Scheller to UNC, if only in a virtual sense. So before we get started, before I turn things over to Dr. Scheller, I'd like to thank UNC Center for the Study of the American South, which has generously sponsored this event, as well as the working group from which it emerged, the Travel Work Graduate Working Group on Mobility and Placemaking. We started this working group in 2018 as a space for grad students who are interested in topics of mobility and place, roads, boundaries, and territory to share work with each other. And we hope that with this event, as well as the more formal relationship that we now have with the Center for the Study of the American South, that we can open this up to grad students using all methodologies from UNC, the Research Triangle, and maybe even beyond. So if you're watching this from another institution and you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so at travelwork.unc.edu. I want to thank also Julia Pawlowski for her essential technical support. I'm now going to turn things over to Lucas Kelley, my co-organizer with Travelwork, to introduce Dr. Scheller.
Great, thanks, Isaiah. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mimi Scheller. Dr. Scheller is a professor of sociology, head of the sociology department, and the founding director of the Center for Mobility's Research and Policy at Drexel University. She received her Bachelor of Arts in History from Harvard University and her PhD from the New School for Social Research. Throughout her career, Dr. Scheller has helped establish the new interdisciplinary field of mobility's research. She is the past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic, and Mobility, the co-editor of the journal Mobilities, which he co-founded in 2006, and an associate editor of Transfers, Interdisciplinary Journal of Mobility Studies. Dr. Scheller is the author or co-editor of 15 books, including most recently Mobility Justice, The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes, which was published by Verso in 2018. Aluminum Dreams, The Making of Light Modernity, published in 2014 by MIT Press, and Citizenship from Below, published in 2012 by Duke University Press. Volumes co-edited by Dr. Scheller include Mobilities and Complexities in 2018, Mobilities Intersections, also published in 2018, the Routledge Handbook of Mobilities, published in 2013, and Mobility and Locative Media, published in 2014. Today's talk is entitled Radical Visions for Caribbean Reconstruction, Island Futures and Mobility Justice, and is based on our current book project, Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene, which will be published by Duke University Press, and is about post-disaster recovery and climate adaptation in the Caribbean, with a focus on Haiti. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Scheller to UNC.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Isaiah, Lucas, and the whole Travel Work group. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides here. Okay, so I hope you can all see that. And so, yeah, so my talk today is based on my book, which actually it came out already. It came out in November 2020. So it's still new because since we're all remote, I haven't been able to go out and do a book tour and actually hand it to people, but it does exist. Here it is. And the book is called Island Futures, but I want to focus on kind of describing the lead up to the book and a little bit about the book. And then I really want to also talk about some contemporary political events that are going on in the Caribbean right now as we speak. So, let's see. So first, in introducing the kind of background to the work I'm doing, I want to talk about the coloniality of climate. And this is an image from an inland lake within Haiti, Lake Azoulay. And as you can see, there's deforested hillsides around it. This lake flooded, covering lots of acres of farmland and buildings and roads. And it's thought to be related to climate change. And I want to think about the devastating impacts that climate change is already having on the Caribbean region, and the ways in which we need to think about our relationship to the Caribbean in this context of the long history of relations, unequal relations between the North Atlantic and the Caribbean region. And first, I'll give a little bit of background to my work. So my PhD was published in 2000 under the title Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica. So I've been studying Haiti and as well as Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean since the 1990s. And I've had many occasions to travel there, both as a researcher, but also as a tourist, as a conference goer, and in the projects I'm going to talk about today, as a kind of academic traveler, which is what I want to reflect on, is that travel that links our regions together. And the image on the cover of that first book, in that edition, which you can't really get anymore, is the image from the Haitian flag, the symbol of the Haitian Revolution, superimposed on the kind of colors that are associated with Pan-Africanism, with Rastafari, with kind of Jamaican cultural colors. And so part of the book was about recognizing the intersection of Jamaican and Haitian political movements, political culture, and kind of Pan-African movements, really. And I think that's important to point out that throughout my work, I've tried to look at the connections between places and how people and ideas and things like newspapers and revolutionary ideas, how they circulated around the region. The next book is Consuming the Caribbean, which was published in 2003, From Arawaks to Zombies, which was a kind of post-dissertation, everything I couldn't fit in the dissertation. It's a kind of 500-year history of relations between the Northern Atlantic and the Caribbean region in terms of different forms of consumption. And then I went into kind of the field of mobilities research, and I did a series of publications on mobilities research. But then in 2012, I returned to those questions that were still on my mind about Haitian and Jamaican political cultures. And in that book, Citizenship from Below, I really focused on the aspects of gender and gendered politics, and what I call drawing on Audre Lorde, erotic agency and Caribbean freedom. So those first three monographs, in some ways, I would say that my more recent work, Aluminum Dreams from 2014, the Mobility Justice from 2018, and Island Futures, the book I'm going to talk about today, are in a way picking up on some of the themes of those books, but in even more extensive ways, and kind of bringing into it the mobilities turn, the mobilities perspective, and the questions around mobility justice. And so that's what I'm going to try to focus on. But you'll see, like, Aluminum Dreams picks up on Consuming the Caribbean and the questions of extraction and unequal resource use and exploitation of the region and its ecological impacts. And Island Futures picks up on the kind of political movements, right? The social and political movements and the different kinds of solidarity and contestation for forms of freedom, I would say, and self-determination. In terms of climate, we're all, I think, by now very aware of the hurricanes that are affecting the Caribbean region. I was writing the book initially, kind of finishing it up in 2018. And of course, hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the region, and especially Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, where I think Americans were very aware of the impact there. And Jamaican climate scientist Michael Taylor wrote at the time that we're really in an unfamiliar climate. So although there have always been hurricanes in the Caribbean, he says that scientific analysis shows that the climate of the region is already changing in ways that seem to signal the emergence of a new climate regime. And hurricanes Irma and Maria fit this pattern all too well, because it was very unusual for such large storms to form back to back like that. Alongside other emerging climate patterns, there's a strong case to be made that there's something unfamiliar about the Caribbean's climate today. And then, of course, came Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And the incredible devastation of that storm and the way it sort of stalled over Grand Bahama and just stayed there for more than 24 hours, I think brought home to a lot of people that climate change is here now and it's urgent. And also the problems that we saw again and again, going back to Hurricane Katrina and its impact on New Orleans, this idea of racially uneven vulnerability and death. That is, that the post-hurricane recovery was uneven, and then the ways in which different communities were impacted was racially uneven. And here, from Hurricane Dorian, is a discussion by Angelique Nixon saying that Haitian migrants and Haitian Bahamians are one of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in the Bahamas. They're too often ignored, treated inhumanely, and it's likely that many undocumented Haitian migrants in Abaco were probably fearful to seek shelter in the storm, even with mandatory evacuation. And on the right-hand side here, you see a sort of flyer from an evangelical church after Hurricane Dorian called Operation Sovereign Bahamas, calling for eradicating illegal migrants in the Bahamas, shanty towns down. So they took the devastation of the hurricane as a moment to actually attack migrants and to call for their removal from the country. So this is an issue, I think, that affects the region and links to our current policies in the United States, which is that despite being the largest contributor to climate change, to global warming, to excess consumption of fossil fuels, we have not helped those affected by it. We did not give temporary protected status to Bahamians or to the many Haitian migrants who were affected. And in fact, when we look at our US-Mexico border, we are deporting Central Americans who are affected by climate change as well as by our policies there. And we're currently deporting Haitians despite political unrest in the country at the moment, which I'm going to return to in a moment. And we're deporting people in the middle, of course, of a COVID-19 pandemic, and they've been shown that the people being deported are infected already. So I want to turn next then to the processes of research. As those hurricanes were happening, I was writing Island Futures, but I was writing it looking back at the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, which is referred to as Haitians with an Anamana poetic term, which is gudu gudu. And it was a devastating event, that I think really shook not just Haiti, but the world, and led to this kind of outpouring of a desire of many people to reach out a humanitarian hand and help Haiti recover from this earthquake. But there was huge failures within that recovery process. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened in terms of reflecting on the role of humanitarians and engineers and academic researchers, including my own involvement in that. And in a way, the book itself is a kind of reflection on that process, looking back over this kind of 10-year period. So you see here the kind of the sort of typical kind of media coverage of the earthquake, showing that it was, a 7.0 magnitude, centered on the town of Léogâne, just to the west of Port-au-Prince. 230,000 people perished, possibly, although really the numbers are not quite known. 300,000 people were injured, 1.5 million were left homeless. 9 months after the earthquake, the UN troops accidentally introduced cholera into the country. That led to 10,000 deaths and more than 750,000 infections. And in general, as people looked back at this process of what was called Build Back Better, which is ironically our country's current mantra for what we need to do right now, there was a complete failure of Build Back Better. And so in the book, I talk about the ways in which decolonial political frames can help us expand the questions of post-disaster reconstruction beyond these notions of bouncing back, building back better, and even in terms of the hurricanes of climate adaptation, climate resilience, because we need to ask, what is the temporality of the disaster under discussion? Is it last year? Is it 10 years? Or is it 500 years? Who should decide what is to be done? And also who should pay? That is, there's a question of reparations and responsibility. And how do we move towards restorative justice and what can be called epistemic justice to think about what would radical reconstruction look like rather than just sort of managing the emergency response. So I got involved with a research group out of my university, Drexel University. There was a group of engineers from our civil and environmental engineering department, and I joined their NSF rapid application for a project called Supporting Haitian Infrastructure Reconstruction with Local Knowledge. And we went to Haiti in March 2010, so about 2.5 months after the earthquake had happened. And we returned in the summer in June of 2010. And then we kind of were working on that project until 2012. And the project was centered in Léogâne, and we trained a team of 6 Haitian university students, shown on the bottom right here, who conducted 171 surveys in Creole over 5 days in the town of Léogâne and the surrounding area. We also conducted semi-structured interviews with NGOs, government officials, and other local people. And then we held a one-day workshop with 76 participants, shown in the other image here, who represented 40 local community-based kind of grassroots organizations. They were organizations of women, organizations of small farmers, organizations of youth, et cetera. And we did a physical survey of water and sanitation infrastructure. And what we were doing was asking people about access to water. And you'll see here an image of children waiting in line to get treated water from a kind of humanitarian distribution point. And all of the earthquake affected population were without access to water, and there were many water distribution places set up. And I should say all of the photos that you'll see in the slides here are my own photos. And normally I actually don't like to show photos of children, and I tried not to show photos of children in my book, because there's a very problematic relationship between my ability to arrive in this earthquake affected area, to take pictures, to gather data, to travel around, et cetera, versus the people shown here who are unable to leave the area or to move around easily or to get water easily or to have cell phone access. And so part of the book is reflecting on this vast inequality between outside foreign responders and the people who were affected by the event. And the kind of community organizations that came to our workshop were not being included in any kind of planning or decision-making processes. And that was part of the problem. Here's the workshop shown happening and the way in which we recorded everything as people deliberated and voted on different options and wrote it on these large kind of poster boards and then presented it to the group and then voted on, these were about different solutions for dealing with the water and sanitation situation. And they had many ideas, many comprehensive ideas, and none of these were really being addressed or funded by any of the outside NGOs or development organizations that were involved in the situation. And then, so while reflecting on that whole process, I had a second opportunity to return to the region with another group of engineers on an NSF rapid called Understanding Sudden Hydroclimatic Changes and Exploring Sustainable Solutions in the Anriquillo Closed Water Basin, which is this two large lakes, one on the Haitian border called Lake Azuay, and one in the Dominican Republic called Lake Anriquillo. And while the engineering group were doing different kinds of measurement and hydrology on the lakes to understand why they were flooding and to understand its relationship to climate change, to rainfall patterns, to heating, sea surface temperatures, et cetera, I was going around interviewing affected people with a colleague from the Dominican Republic. I'm here in the yellow hat. Here, this is us talking to a couple of ladies who lived near Lake Enriquillo and were explaining to us how they did fishing and how they were unable to fish anymore on the lake. So those two projects enabled me to go back over a period of time and visit the region. But as I was kind of reflecting on that, and then as the hurricanes started happening, as I was writing the book, it became a larger project about the future of islands in the Caribbean and our relationship to them as Americans. And this image is a satellite image, from a NASA satellite, and it shows the island that we call Hispaniola, that used to be called Haiti or Quisqueya. And you'll see the sort of dark region where the two lakes are in the sort of lower half of the island. And that actually used to be a sea passage. The sea used to cross all the way through there. And at one end, on the eastern end, you have Santo Domingo, and on the western end of that passage, you have Port-au-Prince, and in between are these deep saltwater lakes. And the lower region, that sort of long, skinny peninsula, used to then be a separate island. This is hundreds of thousands of years ago. And it was inhabited by the Taino people. And when Christopher Columbus arrived here and returned with his sons, he wanted to enslave those people and found sugar plantations. And there was a leader of that whole southern region. The southern region was called Jaragua, and it was led by Queen Anacaona. And Columbus's sons and the then governor of Spanish governor who was sent over, they betrayed her, they executed her and all of her court, and they took over the island in the late 1500s, the 1570s. But the lakes were a sacred site. So those two lakes that our project was dealing with, the flooding, were a sacred site for the Taino, and there's an island in the center of the lake which has ancient artifacts on it. And in fact, when we were there, we were also shown seashells that were found from the ancient ocean floor in the middle of this island. So what I want to do now is just talk briefly about the chapters of the book and describe what I call issues around mobility justice. And in this case, chapter 1 on kinopolitical power. And each of the chapters is actually associated also with what is called a loi in Voodoo. And you'll see a symbol of different loi on the bottom of each slide, because as I was writing the book, I realized that each chapter, from a sort of Haitian epistemic view, was about powers that we think of as political or economic or sort of social structural powers, but they're also spiritual powers. And so the spiritual powers infuse the story. And in the chapter on kinopolitical power, I'm really thinking about these constellations of mobility, which you can see exemplified on this road on the left-hand side, where you see moto taxi drivers, you see women who are getting rides on those moto taxis, right? They've hired them to take them somewhere. You see a kind of white SUV, which is the kind of vehicle my research group might have been traveling around in, with air conditioning, a rental car, windows shut. You see a UN truck in the background, which There's a white truck that's used by the UN peacekeepers. And also on the right, you see a UN peacekeepers base. The peacekeepers at the time were called MINUSTA. They were mainly Brazilian. And they traveled around in those trucks, often heavily armed, wearing military gear. And then beyond the trucks, you can see in the background, it's a little hard to see, but there's painted tap-taps, which are the buses that are used. And so for me, this kind of roadway symbolizes these uneven powers of mobility and different kinds of access to mobility, different degrees of safety while on the road. There's many road accidents in Haiti, and the forms of travel that most people have available to them are not safe at all. You can see this roadway is unpaved. There was rubble everywhere because of the earthquake. And then you see the heavily guarded UN base with communication infrastructure. So the mobility infrastructures I talk about are both the roadways, the transportation, but also the communications and the way in which foreigners and outsiders were able to connect to satellite communication, to cell phone communication, to expensive international data plans that allowed us to download a lot of information, maps and translation and all sorts of things. So there was this deep inequality that I refer to as differences in kinopolitical power, kino meaning movement or mobility, and the sort of politics of mobility. And this was also about the ways in which the entire earthquake response was about containing people within Haiti and not allowing people to leave. The second chapter on water power looks at examples of humanitarian efforts to sort of bring water to the earthquake affected population. And again, the deep inequalities in that. On one side, you see a Samaritan's Purse water filtration system from Water Missions International. And this was at the location where my research team were staying. And we had access to water through this filtration system, which had been put there for camp of internally displaced people. You see a young girl still has to carry that water, which is, not very convenient, to take it back to tents, which are in a muddy kind of field next door. Whereas we were in rooms in a building with fans, with mosquito nets, with electricity, which was delivered by a diesel generator so we could power our laptops and our cell phones. So again, deeply unequal relations. And eventually the people at this location were kicked off of the land where they had their camp, and they were angry, and they came back and they dismantled this water filtration system, and they took it and carried it down the road, even though it sort of belonged to Samaritan's Purse. And on the right-hand side, again, I tell the story of another conflict over access to water, which is this is a solar-powered water filtration kiosk it was put in by Oxfam Italia in a small village. And it was supposed to provide showers and a washing area and drinkable water to this whole area. When we got there, it wasn't working. And I tell the story about how we tried to figure out why it wasn't working and opened up that locked white door and discovered that inside there was actually, they were using the solar panel to charge a whole bunch of laptop computers and cell phones. So they had repurposed it not for water. And so that's another really interesting story about relations of power. Aerial power in chapter 3 is again about who has access to travel, who has access to airplanes, to airports, to the aerial view, the aerial gaze, to the sort of technologies of air power, and the ways in which that was occupied by the US military, who came and took over the airport very quickly, brought in military flights before allowing humanitarian flights to arrive. And I look at the whole sort of operation of this airspace and the control of airspace, which is pertinent to the post-earthquake situation, but is also pertinent to understanding the entire Caribbean region and how it is controlled under basically US military hegemony, which determines who can travel through Caribbean airspace and and the different routes available, as well as sea space. The chapter on digital power, here you see some small shops that offer telephone charging or electronic equipment repair. And in this chapter, I talk about the ways in which communications and digital infrastructure are both kind of created as a form of infrastructural power from above, but they're also appropriated from below. And I'm very interested in the way in which people patch together their own digital communications systems and networks, and how they sort of tap into the electricity grid and to the systems for mobile money, for sending money from the diaspora back to Haiti, and for basically trying to sort of get in on this communication system that in some ways they're excluded from. In the next chapter on bordering power, I turn to this question of climate change and the lakes and the crossing of the Haitian-Dominican border. And here again, for those of you interested in roads, you see here National Highway 2, which is being overtaken by Lake Azoé in Haiti, which is flooding the highway. So it's now a gravel track, it's unpaved, it's being eaten away by water. And you see some of the flooding in that area. And I talk here about my own border crossing experience with my research team, the movement of our truck of equipment back and forth across the border, and the different forms of contestation that are happening over who controls that border and how the border is created by the mobilities across it, and what I call the sort of the structural holes within state sovereignty and the sort of different territorialities that are implicated in the border, both legal and illegal, state actors and non-state actors, and then the action, the power of the lake itself, of the water, of climate change, and how that also is implicated in the border. In this chapter, I thought it was very important to address the question of what I called sexual power, in the sense of sexual domination and sexual violence, and violence against women and against children. And you see two types of actors here. On one side, you may recognize Bill Clinton. So I was at what was called a WASH cluster meeting, Water and Sanitation Housing Group of the United Nations. We were on a UN base, and suddenly, kind of helicoptering in out of nowhere, is Bill Clinton, and I believe he's with Paul Farmer. And he walks, right by where I'm standing there. And it was a reminder both of the mobilities that were happening around here and the fact that the UN base where the WASH cluster was meeting and making decisions about water and sanitation completely excluded Haitians. It was fortified. You needed to show ID to get in there. And meetings were conducted in French, not in Creole. But the question of who has power of mobility in Haiti also relates to who has power in terms of women's freedom of movement. And on the right-hand side is a photo of the kind of security detail sitting outside the mayor of Léogâne's office while we were waiting to go in to see him. They did not look happy that I was taking their photo. I tried to do it as quickly as I could. And I bring these two images together because there was a terrible occurrence of rape and sexual violation happening throughout this period. That is, there was no security for women and children in the IDP camps, the internally displaced people's camps, but also more generally in Haiti. Rape is often used in political conflicts, but also UN peacekeepers, the military troops who were there supposedly keeping people safe, were found to be involved in a scandal of sexual abuse of children, where hundreds of children reported abuse over a period of time by Sri Lankan peacekeepers. who were never prosecuted or arrested. And likewise, humanitarian responders, if you want to call them that, from Oxfam, shortly after this period of the earthquake, also got in trouble because they were using sex workers in what were described as orgies. And there was a lot of prostitution going on, sex work, and abuse of the availability of poor women and poor children for men's use. And I thought it was interesting that that doesn't get talked about in these kind of disaster recovery situations, except by women's groups. I mean, the women's groups who were protesting this, but in terms of like the planners and the deciders and the engineers and all of those people, that was not part of what they thought they were supposed to be thinking about. And I argue that this kind of sexual power is crucial to understanding. And in particular, these are images from Jimani on the Dominican side of the border. I argue that sex trafficking begins in traffic. That is, that women don't have access to vehicles. They don't have access to motorbikes and cars and trucks, and they need to get rides via men. And often foreign men have more access to mobility power than women do, and also economic opportunities. And so part of the problems around sexual violence and sexual trafficking in the Dominican Republic has to do partly with this questions of kinopolitical power. So I just want to start kind of moving towards this question of, okay, I said this talk was about radical reconstruction. So I've talked about the sort of overview of the book, the different inequalities in power, the forms of kind of patchwork or resistance from below, and efforts by people to self-determine their own recovery. And what happens in the subsequent sort of period after I finished writing the book is a huge political mobilization. And so a lot of people were feeling just very like an end, like that there had been an end to Haiti's political kind of movements, and that everything was just kind of beaten down. And then just at that moment, it reignited. And here you see a protester carrying the red and black flag of Dessalines and wearing the hat, which is, you know, associated with the Haitian Revolution, as well as with the Voodoo Loi Ogun. And so in this final part of the book, I call it This Is Not a Requiem. And I want to expand on that argument by thinking now about what's happened since then, and really since I finished the book. And in a way, the book opens with a preface that I call an autobiography of my mother. And my mother was very much involved in political activism throughout the years that I was growing up and as a teenager, and in solidarity movements and women's movements with Central America, with the Caribbean, with calls both for, as you see on the t-shirt on the right, democracia en el país y en la casa. So democracy in the nation and in the household, and linking together military violence as well as gun violence on the streets of American cities, like we see now in cities like Philadelphia. We've had a huge increase in murders this year, and that's an issue she'd been marching and working on. And she had this collection of political t-shirts, which inspired my look at solidarity politics in the book. So I want to just talk about what's happening right now. And there was an excellent roundtable on the 20th of March called Understanding Haiti's Contemporary Crisis, and in quotation marks, and Solidarity Politics. It was organized by the NACLA report, the North America, Caribbean, and Latin America report, and moderated by Mamira Duget-Prosper and Mark Schuler, who's an anthropologist. And I was very impressed with the analysis given by these participants: Mehdi Chalmer, James Darbouze, Gerline Joseph, Dr. Sabine Lamour, Samuel Nesner, James Olivier, and Ninaj Raoul. And they talked about right now there's a mobilization happening, a sort of uprising against the government of Jovenel Moïse, who is considered illegitimate in remaining in the presidency. He's been blocking elections from happening, and he's trying to do a constitutional rewriting process that is very, very contested. And if you're interested in solidarity with Haiti, on this Monday, March 29th, is an International Day of Solidarity. And the groups involved in it are demanding that the Biden administration end its support for Jovenel Moïse, the current president, withdraw from participation in this Haiti's constitutional process. That is, the US has been sort of putting their thumb on the scale and kind of intervening in the process and saying what we think is his right to be president or to rewrite the Constitution. They want us to stop interfering in the internal affairs of Haiti and stop deporting Haitians who are fleeing their country. And I think this mobilization is really important and significant, and it's re-sparked kind of movements within Haiti that many people thought were over. But I also want to talk about other movements happening across the Caribbean region. And so these are all movements that are responding to the current moment, to contemporary politics. And what do we need to do? How do we reconstruct societies, whether after the earthquake, whether after the hurricanes, or whether after 500 years of colonialism, right? And there's a very important work has been done by Caribbean feminists. There's this Caribbean feminism series, which you can find at the link here at blackwomenradicals.com, with a reading list and with videos of a number of recent panels that have been held. And here you see a number of Caribbean feminists over the years. There's also been a very significant movement in Puerto Rico since Hurricanes Irma and Maria about building a just recovery. Anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla argues that vulnerability is not simply a product of natural conditions, it's a political state and a colonial condition. So there's been a movement of people's assemblies, and they they got the governor of Puerto Rico thrown out after a scandal in 2017, but other writers talk about the just recovery from Puerto Rico, in which people have come together to design a bold and holistic plan for the island to be rebuilt as a beacon for a safe, resilient, and thriving society in the era of climate chaos, economic inequality, and rising white nationalism. And according to Elizabeth Yampierre and Naomi Klein, the work is rooted in the belief that the reason behind these current crises is the fact that the island's people and land have been treated like a bottomless raw resource for the mainland, that's the US, the rest of us, to mine for over a century, never mind the devastating economic consequences. So we see a lot of groups, like this is just one small example. This one's called La Colmena Cimarrona, or the Maroon Hive, which is an agroecology group in the island of Vieques. And they're trying to build kind of food justice, food sovereignty, and racial and economic justice and solidarity across the region. Again, anti-extractivism, there's a very significant anti-extractivism or anti-mining, anti-oil drilling movement, and against extractive tourism. And this is my friend and colleague Esther Figueroa, who's a Jamaican independent filmmaker. And I helped co-produce her film called Fly Me to the Moon, which is a featured documentary about aluminum and bauxite mining. And it kind of interties with my own book, Aluminum Dreams. And we did a lot of research together and traveled together. And she'll be giving a virtual lecture tomorrow, March 26th at 5 p.m. on environmental injustice and impossible futures at University of Florida's Department of English, if you want to look that up online. And the movie is screening all this week through Vimeo if you register for that event. And again, these multiple movements. So the Haitian political uprising, the Puerto Rican people's assemblies, the feminist movements, also very significant LGBTQ movements and movements against violence against women are happening across the Caribbean, and these anti-extractivist movements. And finally, the case for climate reparations. And there's a significant mobilization right now across the Caribbean to present a transnational case for reparations for slavery. And I believe that those reparations for slavery can be tied to reparations for climate. There was an event just held on March 18th with historian Natasha Lightfoot from Columbia University, Dr. Vereen Shepherd, the director of the Center for Reparations Research at University of the West Indies, and Sakaya Thomas, who's chair of the Global African Congress. And there's a second event coming up on March 31st. And again, these movements are calling for the global North, in a way, to pay back the debt that is owed to the Caribbean region for slavery, but also, I would say, for climate debt that we owe as well. So just to sort of start to wrap up with some conclusions. In the book, I argue that we need to help break the cycle of extractive economies, fossil fuel extraction, tourism dependence, labor exploitation, and unsustainability that have really shaped the Caribbean over recent centuries. We need to reject current plans for using the Caribbean as a logistics hub, a low-wage export zone, or a plantation zone where nature becomes this kind of global infrastructure. And to do that, we also need, in this post-COVID moment, we need to not bounce back and recover tourism to its full extent, especially not cruise ship tourism or the kinds of mass tourism that have been devastating Caribbean environments. We need to limit tourist mobility. We need to end our own overconsumption of energy and of travel. We need to imagine alternative post-development futures for the entire region that will be more resilient and flexible and would allow for movement in the hurricane season, allow people to move out and return. We need to build food sovereignty and security. We need protection of water sources, protection of coastal areas and fisheries. We need to replant mangrove forests and reseed coral reefs, which can be done. And we need to learn from agroecological projects how to expand Caribbean food sovereignty through things like regenerative low-till and no-till conservation agriculture, through agroforestry, through tree intercropping systems using tropical staple trees, and through the multi-crop gardening systems known as Kanuko, which is an Arawak term, which involves the use of these prolific traditional root crops like cassava or yucca, it's sometimes called, that are hurricane proof because they're under the ground. It's a food security system built to adapt to hurricanes. So there's many kind of ideas that popular movements and people's movements and grassroots movements in the Caribbean region are pushing for. And I want to end with this quote from Malini Ranganathan and Eve Bratman on Abolition Democracy, which is an approach to climate justice rooted in abolitionism, one that seeks to address racism and climate-induced harm together. And, you know, when I talk about Reconstruction, I draw on W.E.B. Du Bois's radical Black Reconstruction in the Americas, which is a kind of radical view of the entire reconstruction of democracy and the economy after the Civil War, and his notion of abolition democracy, which they argue was attentive to the interconnected spheres that were and are necessary to achieve unfinished Black emancipation after the end of slavery. An abolitionist approach to climate justice demands attention to historical reparations and intersectional processes that are not solely associated with climate, things like housing, policing, and food security, and I would add mobility justice. An emphasis on reparative humanism reminds us that environmental harm often proceeds via dehumanization. As such, an anti-racist humanist approach to climate praxis embeds narratives of healing from historical trauma. It embraces intersectional thinking, making unlikely connections between spheres. And I believe that we need to make the connection between how we live in North America and what its impact is on the Caribbean region. And instead of a humanitarian response where we think we are the Good Samaritans bringing aid to the poor victims of these disasters, we need to recognize that we caused the disaster. And thank you, and end there. I'm looking forward to questions, and I end with an image from a painting by LeVar Monroe called Rehearsal for Reconstruction, which seemed a fitting way to end.
Thank you so much for that lecture, Dr. Scheller. We welcome the audience to submit their questions via the Q&A portal, which they should be able to find. Everyone should be able to find on your the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. I'll just go ahead and start while the audience gathers their thoughts. I'll start us off with a question, and it goes back to the some of the workshops that you observed. I think it was in the aftermath of the earthquake or possibly one of the hurricanes. Because you mentioned these visions for radical reconstruction, and I'm wondering what visions for that kind of a reconstruction you were able to observe in these community-based workshops, the ones that didn't get heard by the NGOs and all the other folks who were there to help, so to speak. So if you could say a little bit more about that and how that might fit in to this notion of island futures as coming from the island itself, the people who live there.
Sure. Let me show you that briefly, that shot there of the, so this was a workshop held, it was after the earthquake, and it was in the area of, in the commune of Léogâne, including both people from the town and people from the surrounding area. And what they call for is, we were talking specifically about water and sanitation, and they were coming up with ideas and voting, and the biggest vote getter of the day was to protect the environment from the top of the mountains down to the shore, to the sea. And they understood that the whole water system was interconnected. So NGOs were coming in and they were trucking in water and distributing water, and they were building latrines, shallow kind of pit latrines. And what the people said was that was not going to work. That was not good. So they say here to construct fountains, like public water fountains, to construct drainage, to construct latrines that are not near water sources, to construct artisanal wells, that is like tap into the deeper water, not to like truck in water, and to have committees to supervise it, and to do reforestation and more woods, and to protect the water sources, and to treat the water, and to have canals, canalization, which would help deal with flooding and provide irrigation for farming, promotion of hygiene, and to have piped water that could get to each house. Okay, and they talked a lot about, they talked in terms of public fountains and shared water sources. And it was very interesting to me because the NGOs took a very different approach in terms of how they understood what the reconstruction involved. And the communities really understood the complexity of the water system, the different kinds of access people need, the willingness to share certain kinds of water resources, and the households that are built in a formation that's called coup, which is a kind of cluster of houses of a family, and that they could share a water source there. And so there's just a lot of cultural specificity that foreign agents did not understand or appreciate.
Looks like we just got a question in the chat as well, and I'll go ahead and read it out for everyone. So this person's along similar lines. This person's asking, is there any potential for tourists to support local efforts with their tourist dollars? For example, by carefully choosing lodging, entertainment, restaurants that are community owned, or is any tourism to the Caribbean going to do more harm than good? And then this person goes on to say, how they've been hearing a lot of conversation about traveling post-COVID as a way to support local economies. but I hear that there's ecological destruction and inequity furthered by tourism.
Yeah, and it's a very complicated question, and I want to recommend this book called Stuck with Tourism by Matilda Cordoba Azcarate, which is about the Yucatan Peninsula and the tourism around Cancun, but she also looks at forms of like ecotourism and community-based cultural tourism. And she shows how development projects to bring tourism, even so-called sustainable tourism or ecotourism or cultural tourism, are very problematic, and that there's very difficult questions around labor exploitation, ecological impacts, conflicts between different groups, as well as ultimately the sort of resilience of a region to climate change. And so I can't give like an easy answer, but in general, I believe that tourism has been very detrimental to many parts of the Caribbean. And partly it's the scale of tourism. It's too huge, it's too big, it's taken over coastal areas, it's cut coastal areas off from local inhabitants. It involves sand mining to bring sand in and dump it on the beaches where it then gets washed away and has to be dumped again. Mangrove forests are cut down all the time to build tourist resorts that are like clean and nice. Cruise ships have an incredible burden of pollution that they impose on localities. And then the other problem we see now is that pandemic fleers and remote workers are moving to or buying property in the Caribbean. There was just an article about the US Virgin Islands and all the people who want to move there right now. But it's happening in a lot of places. And so like many smaller places, they're being overrun by people with more money who are buying up property. And again, it creates an imbalance of access to housing. So many, many problematic issues around tourism.
So another question coming in. Your notion of being, quote, an academic traveler was interesting. What advice do you have for early career scholars or researchers at any age of their career, any stage of their career, to work with local communities without engaging in an academic form of exploitative extraction of knowledge, et cetera? In other words, what steps are necessary to being responsible academic travelers ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, I think is the question of like long-term time commitment. So it's really not helpful when people sort of parachute in, do their project, and then they leave and they're gone, right? And that's extractive. More positive would be building a long-term relationship, planning on your research becoming much more like embedded in a community, and finding out how your skills and your project are useful to what they want, and have it driven by the community's kind of determination, decision about what they would like to see happen and what their needs are. That's one way to think about it. I think it's important to learn the local language. And to be honest, I learned how, I mean, I can understand Haitian Creole fairly well. I can read it, but I don't speak it that well yet. But I know many anthropologists who spend much more time and who do speak the language. And it's important to also, I think, build capacities in local academic institutions, right? So if you're going to a place to do research, partner with the local institutions. So for example, the anthropologist who I mentioned, Mark Schuler, he became a professor at the State University of Haiti and works at the university, teaches there, shares knowledge, shares skills, and so on, to also help Haitian professors, Haitian students, for example, to promote their work, to be able to publicize their work, to be involved and invited in events, to cite their work. All of those types of things, whatever community you're working in, it's really important to build those relationships and build those capacities locally.
So yeah, I had a question, if you don't mind, Dr. Scheller, while maybe some more people in the audience are typing theirs up. So you talked a little bit about the border between Haiti and the Dominican, and you sort of mentioned that, kind of touched on how its legitimacy depended on how people approach the border. And in my work, I often think about how structuring mobility is a form of colonialism, which I think you definitely see it similarly in Haiti. Could you talk specifically about how this colonial imposed border and maybe how its enforcement relates to colonization, as well as how people on the ground kind of see it as legitimate?
Okay, so good question. This particular border, the Haitian Dominican Republic border, is not exactly a colonial border in the sense that we might think of other colonial borders, because there's a complicated history where after the Haitian Revolution and the Dominican side of the island was controlled by Spain, the Haitian forces liberated it from the Spanish and unified the island from the 1820s to the 1840s. And then the Dominicans kind of sought independence from Haiti. So that makes it a slightly weird border, but there were colonial powers involved in continuing that Dominican movement against Haiti. So there was Spanish involvement and US kind of diplomatic involvement and arms dealing behind the scenes going on, or military support. So it's a complicated history of that border. And then what's happened is the US occupied both countries, right, in the early 20th century for a long period of time, and then moved labor force from Haiti into the Dominican Republic, who then remained there. Initially, they had worked on sugar plantations called batays, and those people then had children, and their children had children. And there's now this large Haitian Dominican population. The Dominican Republic, in recent years, denationalized them. That is, they changed their law to say that they do not have nationality. And so then a lot of Haitian Dominicans were expelled back across the border into Haiti. So you have all that going on, this kind of contestation of citizenship and belonging, and it's tied up with racial categories. But then what I talk about in the chapter is to do with the different actors who have power on the ground at the border. And other people have written about this in other border regions. So for example, like in India, some of the borders there where there's like people who cross back and forth, there's different kinds of trade, there's market trade that happens back and forth over the border. And then there's people who try to collect money, right, every time you cross the border. And sometimes that's the state, but sometimes it's these other nebulous kind of gray actors, police forces and guides and money changers and all different people who are kind of trying to get money at the border. So, and then there's smuggling, right? There's smuggling, there's trafficking, there's the narco economy, there's the gun trade. So there's a lot going on at borders, and they're not like a clean, separation. They're constantly being produced through this work of crisscrossing the border. And in a way, the border serves to, it creates what Peter Hudson has a book about banking in the Caribbean, and he describes it as the holographic state. The state projects itself as being a state with sovereignty, when in fact it's completely riddled with non-sovereign powers that are both subnational and transnational. And I draw a little bit on Saskia Sassen's work there to talk about territory and territoriality and these different legal regimes that influence the making of the border.
Thanks so much for that answer. It looks like we have another question coming in. the author writes, "You're quite conscious about your positionality in the book and your team's complicity in some of these uneven mobilities and motilities." Maybe you could say something about that term. Can you say more about how this consciousness of positionality can be a decolonial act / process, etc.?
Thanks. That's a great question, Shiva. And so just to say something about motility. So motility is the potential for mobility. And it refers to the idea that in mobility's theory, that it's not simply about like having more mobility is having more power or more freedom or more, that we all want more mobility. It's actually that those with power, kinopolitical power, can choose, can self-determine when they move and when they stay, when they have things brought to them by others, and when they move around, make other people move, displace other people. Those are all forms of motility, which is this potential and self-determination to have multiple options, multiple choices, whereas many other people are coerced into mobility, are displaced, are forcibly moved. So like mobility is not always a good thing in that sense. And so from the positionality perspective, I think it's important to, and this goes back to the question about like academic researchers, to have a strong amount of self-awareness of how you're moving through a place, and to have humility, right? Humility that you do not have the solutions, you do not have the knowledge, you are not the expert, because so many people would get to Haiti thinking they were bringing their expertise and their knowledge and their help, and then just completely flail around, cause problems, mess stuff up, not understand the culture, not understand what was going on, feel embittered, feel disgruntled, feel like things weren't working right. And there's cultural reasons for those many things and cultural misunderstandings. And so part of, I guess, the decolonial process is to like decolonize our minds and to realize that we, the researchers and the experts from the global north, do not have the answers. And nobody even wants our answers. And many Haitians say they just want the Blancs to go home. The Blancs meaning white, but meaning foreigners, all foreigners. The Blancs go home. We don't want you here. So you need to recognize and incorporate that, and then figure out how can you build a relationship of solidarity from that more humble basis, and learn from the Haitians who are the experts on their own culture and politics.
We still have a little bit of time for if anyone else has any more questions. We still have a little bit of time. Any thoughts, Isaiah?
Well, I do have another question that I could ask if nobody's got one at the moment, and it has to do a little bit with the sort of diasporas from these islands of people coming into the United States, especially to work or make new lives, make new homes. And I was just wondering whether, or to what extent, the island futures that you're talking about in your book and in your talk extend to the diaspora, and how the diaspora maybe factors into the ways in which Haitians and others are thinking about a decolonized island future.
Yeah, so a really important question. And there's multiple ways in which the Haitian diaspora are connected and involved in Haiti. We hear often about remittances, which is the money that the people of Haiti are very reliant on the diaspora sending back to their families, as in many countries, which is the case. There's also the fact that of how the Haitian diaspora were often called the 10th département, that is that they were like a vote a political bloc, a political force, right, that could influence politics within Haiti. I also found, though, that in the earthquake recovery process, that the diaspora also held a certain amount of kinopolitical power, right? They have kinopolitical power because of their ability to move back and forth between the United States and the economy of the United States and Haiti, which put them in a kind of awkward position, right, in relation to Haitians within Haiti, whom, and again, this happens in many places where the populace at home may resent returning diaspora who come with money and build big houses, or, you know, sort of exercise forms of power that local people don't have access to. So there's conflicts as well as solidarities. But I think right now the diaspora plays a really important part in building a constituency within the United States to change US policy in the region. And with the new Biden administration, you know, with Kamala Harris and her own background of her family and of some of the advisors who are working in the administration who come from Caribbean backgrounds as well, there should be an opening to push for a real change in US policy in the region. And this is like the crucial opportunity to do that. And it involves things like ending this kind of exploitative industrial policies that have seen the Caribbean as a low wage, you know, factory zone, opening up relations with Cuba, which is essential, I believe, for the future of the whole region, demilitarizing, right, and you know, stop interfering in the politics through military force and military power, and then new kinds of trade relations that would be based around more equal relationships, and including the cancellation of debt, like to the IMF and the sort of development bank debts as part of a reparations package. And so like there's many policy agendas on the table that could be pushed forward right now with help of the Caribbean diaspora leading that conversation in the United States.
Thank you.
And I should add that agricultural policy is also a big part of that, and the damaging impact of US agricultural policies, which have tried to forcibly, you know, open up the Caribbean to so-called free trade, with our heavily subsidized crops being sold there cheaply, undermining agriculture there, as well as the current efforts that are pushing hybrid seeds and GMO seeds, which cannot be replanted by farmers, and they have to be purchased each year. And again, there's a big movement in the region against that kind of manipulation of agricultural policy that's been standard in US policies in the region.
Thank you so much. So I think we do have a few minutes left. I'm not sure if there are other questions coming in, but I think what I might do is stop the recording process, and then we can see if any questions are coming in.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Scheller. We really appreciate your time and your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Scheller. Yeah, we all really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.